I'm Dr. Thomas Kidd. I'm a senior fellow at the Institute for Studies of Religion. I also teach in the history department. For those of you who don't know, the Institute for Studies of Religion is an interdisciplinary institute at Baylor that seeks to foster high-quality research across the disciplines on religion. And of course, at Baylor we have many people who specialize in various areas of religion, the humanities, social sciences. And the Institute for Studies of Religion seeks to help to bring those people together and encourage them in their work, and especially to foster a kind of research on religion that has obvious public importance and significance, and the sorts of things that people in the general public, the media, will be reading about religion. And we host occasional symposia like this to focus on topics that are of obvious major importance publicly and also to the Baylor community. And I think you can see with the lecture topic that we have today that this is something of obvious historic interest to us here at Baylor. Our speaker today is David Bebbington, a longtime friend of Baylor University and also a distinguished visiting professor of history at Baylor. David has his doctoral degree from the University of Cambridge, and he's taught at the University of Stirling in Scotland since 1976. And for 8 years, Dr. Bebbington has been distinguished visiting professor of history at Baylor, and this has entailed him coming to Baylor every fourth semester and teaching courses in the history department at Truett Seminary and in the religion department. He has quite a number of publications, and I'm not going to try to list all of them, but among the most significant are the 1989 book, Evangelicalism in Modern Britain, a history from the 1730s to the 1980s. And I'll pause on this one to say that this is the book that framed what is now the standard scholarly definition of evangelical Christianity that's used among scholars and also in the media. It's called the Bebbington Quadrilateral, playing off of the Wesleyan quadrilateral, although Dr. Bebbington claims that he's never actually used the term quadrilateral. He did have a 4-point definition of what it means to be an evangelical in this book, and it's thoroughly established now as the standard definition that scholars use. I even noticed recently that it was referenced in an article in the Huffington Post, without even mentioning Dr. Bebbington's name. It said, well, you know, when scholars talk about evangelicalism, it's these 4 points. And I suppose when you're referenced that way without attribution on the Huffington Post, this must mean you've made it as a scholar, you know. So that's how ensconced this is. And I think that shows how prominent Dr. Bebbington really is in the study of Anglo-American religion and evangelicalism in particular. Other books of his include The Mind of Gladstone, Religion, Homer, and Politics in 2004, The Dominance of Evangelicalism, The Age of Spurgeon and Moody, 2005, The Nonconformist Conscience, Chapel and Politics, 1870 to 1914, which originally came out in 1982 with a second edition in 2010. The book Baptists Through the Centuries, A History of a Global People, which came out in 2010. And his current research project is a comparative study of revivals across the English-speaking world in the 19th century. And this is a book that will be published by Oxford University Press in the spring. And today's lecture will share with us a part of that research. And this comparative study looks at revivals in England and Scotland, Australia, and America and other places. But today's lecture, of course, focuses on a particular revival in Texas in the 1840s that led, at least indirectly, to the founding of Baylor University in 1845. So Dr. Bebbington's lecture today is titled The Revival That Founded Baylor, Baptist Faith in Frontier, Texas. Let's welcome David Bebbington.
Ladies and gentlemen, first a word of thanks. Thanks to the Institute for the Studies of Religion for organising the whole of this symposium today, including this occasion. Thanks too to the Texas collection of Baylor University, because that institution provided a very congenial place to do most of the research for this paper. The staff were very attentive to my needs, even in the week before closure at Christmas. And that is the acid test of any institution. Research was put before Christmas. Really good. My topic then is the revival that founded Baylor, Baptist faith in frontier Texas. Baylor was founded in 1845. Today I want to investigate its prehistory and significance by focusing on a revival that took place 4 years earlier in 1841. That was one of the events that helped to shape the future direction of Texas as a whole. Texas had declared its independence from Mexico in 1836. American settlers flocking into its territory from the east established their own state, not within the United States, but entirely separate. And as a separate republic, it lasted for 10 years. It was eventually decided that its future lay with the United States, and annexation came in 1846. But for a decade, Texas was a crucible of experiment. What was the republic's future to be? This was a cultural question as well as a political question. What social, moral, intellectual, and religious factors were to shape the new land? Baylor was part of the answer. But before that, the revival was part of a struggle for the soul of Texas. The place where Texas independence was declared was Washington-on-the-Brazos. In 1841, halfway through the existence of the independent republic, there was a Baptist revival in that town. I want to suggest that this revival provides a key for understanding the cultural history of Texas in that period. Further, this minor episode reveals the forces engaged in competition for domination in the adjacent United States and indeed in the whole of the English-speaking world. Through the microcosm of the revival at Washington-on-the-Brazos, we can appreciate the macrocosm of the evolution of Anglophone culture in the mid-19th century. So I begin with the background. What was Washington-on-the-Brazos? The town stood on our Brazos River in central Texas, 254 miles north of its mouth, just west of Houston. The town was at the reputed head of navigation. Indeed, in the year after revival, the first steamboat reached the town up the river, but unfortunately, plans for regular services had to be abandoned after it stuck on a sandbank on the return journey. The route from east to west passed through the town also, which had a ferry from 1822. The site, therefore, had potential as a centre of communications. It was located in an area of pleasant, rolling country, replete with woods and water. Unlike the more arid prairies to the west, it attracted farmers, produced corn, cotton, and sugar. Yet, in 1841, it was still very much on the frontier. The last buffalo to be shot in Washington County was not killed until 1850. This was where newcomers from the more settled southern states encountered the Wild West. The town was laid out in the 1830s by a speculative developer and named after Washington, Georgia. It was particularly popular for a while because there were hopes that since the town was the birthplace of Texas independence, it would soon be named capital. Yet the population was still small. In 1841, there were only just over 100 adults permanently resident in the town itself. Therefore, Washington was a place of intermittently grand pretensions, but in reality, a tiny frontier settlement. A Baptist church was formed in the town in 1837. It included 8 members, including some colourful characters such as Noah T. Byers, general merchant, armourer to the troops of the Army of the Republic, and later a Baptist preacher, but a man whose zeal often outran his judgment. The leader of the church was Zachariah N. Morrell, a preacher in Tennessee before his arrival in Texas in 1836, but untrained and volatile, probably an abler Indian fighter than Baptist preacher. The church started work on a meeting house and invited the American Baptist home and foreign missions to send a full-time worker. While that request was under consideration, however, the church disintegrated. The Republic of Texas chose to locate its capital not in Washington but in Austin in 1839, and people who had hoped to profit from the development of the town moved elsewhere in search of better fortunes. The church dissolved, though a handful of former members continued to live in the town. However, 3 other Baptist churches were formed in the vicinity in 1839, including one at Independence, only 12 miles down the road in Washington County. In the following year, these 3 churches constituted the Union Baptist Association, and so there seemed to be good prospects for growth in the area. Therefore, the first representative of the American Baptist Home Missionary Society to arrive, James Huckins, who eventually appeared in Texas at the end of 1840, decided to send the second agent of the society to Washington County. This was William M. Tryon, who became joint pastor of Independence and determined to restart the cause in the town of Washington. The church there was organised in March 1841 with 12 members. It was agreed that Tryon should preach monthly, and he arranged a regular Sunday school. The church clerk, Anderson Buffington, one of the members of the earlier church and a licensed exhorter, was an ardent soul winner, and it was Buffington who was the leading spirit in a series of prayer meetings that led in the spring of 1841 to a sense that a revival might come. The scene was set for a remarkable awakening. The revival can be outlined briefly before its wider significance is explored. On Saturday the 24th of July 1841, the monthly meeting of the church was held. Tryon, the minister, brought with him a man of some eminence who was introduced as a visitor to the church, Robert Emmett Bledsoe Baylor, former member of the Houses of Representatives of Kentucky, Alabama, and the United States. Now a Texas judge, Baylor travelled round the state and preached as ordained Baptist minister whenever not administering justice. Judge Baylor was unfortunately known on occasion, when preaching, to get a bit confused and to address his congregation as members of the jury. He had helped Tryon to restart the Washington church 4 months before, and Buffington and his friends from the prayer meeting told the 2 ministers that they thought the Lord would visit the meeting with a revival. Baylor preached in the afternoon to a large congregation, Tryon in the evening, but still nothing in particular happened. On the Sunday morning, however, the temperature began to rise. A slave girl, accepted for church membership on the previous day, was to be the first baptismal candidate of the new church. On the banks of the Brazos, Tryon lectured on believers' baptism and then immersed the girl. It was the first time the River Brazos had been used for believers' baptism. And the public drama of baptism seems to have stirred the town. When Tryon preached in the afternoon, hearts were moved. In the evening, there was an even greater concern for the souls of those who were there. Tryon had to depart early to care for an ailing wife, and so Baylor led the evening prayer meeting, and 2 people actually professed conversion on that occasion. Seeing his hopes for an awakening being realised, Buffington rode off in haste the following morning to bring back Tryon. So on the Monday afternoon, Tryon preached to a crowded congregation, and a popular young physician, Thomas J. Hard, expressed a personal faith. That evening, he and 2 converts of the previous day and a 4th convert were all baptized in the Brazos by Tryon. At an after meeting, the account of the Philippian jailer relating to baptism was read from Acts 16. 10 citizens were anxious inquirers, and 3 of them professed conversion. On the Tuesday, Tryon felt compelled to leave for his wife's bedside, but Baylor remained and baptized another 4 that night. The prayer meetings continued every evening that week, with further baptisms too. Baylor terminated a remarkable series of meetings the following Sunday. It was a deeply stirring episode in the history of the young town. The revival was particularly striking in 3 respects. First, it had made a major impression in terms of numbers. Overall, 31 people professed conversion and 24 were baptized. Others were left for baptism later on, with 6 being immersed on the 22nd of August. The following year, the church reported 50 members. Now, these absolute numbers may not seem large, but they represent a huge impact on so small a settlement. Reports are unanimous that nearly every individual in the town was drawn into the services. More than half the adult citizens who had not previously made a profession of Christian faith now did so. So the little town was transformed in the proportion of active Christians. Second, the converts were commonly prominent figures. Thomas J. Hard, the physician, was the owner of 640 acres and 4 town lots, and spent time in his calls on his patients. He was a good doctor, and he was notably frequent as a witness to legal documents in the town, clearly an eminent and a popular man. Robert A. Lott, who started taking a denominational paper that fall, was probably another convert. At the 1840 census, he'd owned 496 acres, 16 workhorses, 75 cattle, and 1 stud. He also possessed a pleasure carriage, then a rarity in the town. And the person who was baptized, though previously converted, was the wife of Henry R. Cartmel, a town hotelier who in 1840 owned 8 lots and 2 clocks. The Texas census was peculiarly thorough. These were the folk who set the tone of Washington life. All the accounts stress that the most respectable citizens were affected. Thirdly, the revival spread beyond Washington. Tryon and Baylor went on in August to preach at similar events nearby. At a place without a church 8 miles up country, there were 21 converts. At Mount Gilead Baptist Church, about 25 miles to the south, there were 39. The flame of the awakening, once kindled, readily burned over the adjacent area. The Washington revival made a very significant impact. The stir caused by the revival can partly be explained by its atmosphere. As an old man in the 1870s, Judge Baylor recalled the events in which he'd played so prominent a part. He particularly remembered the baptisms after nightfall, the first ever performed at Washington. The proceedings started at the courthouse, where the Declaration of Independence had been signed. It served also as the Baptist place of worship. From there, the congregation marched in procession, singing hymns, down the main street of the town to the River Brazos. Baylor had asked the candidates to dress in white and wear white handkerchiefs round their heads. This was no doubt a practical measure to keep the hair under control in the water, but the whiteness of the handkerchiefs echoed the symbolism of the clothes. The candidates were being baptized into purity. A beautiful strand of white sand running out into the river reinforced the impression of whiteness, contrasting with the surrounding darkness. There, recalled Baylor, we stood on the strand, not a cloud was to be seen in the heavens, and the silver moon with her train of brilliant stars threw their light down on this beautiful, touching, and solemn scene. The baptisms took place, the large crowd on the bank joined in the songs, and after the last one, we stood silently for a moment to listen to the song with its echoes as they died away in murmurs down the River Brazos. A 17-year-old youth, the son probably of one of the baptismal candidates, confirms the power of the event. talking of the solemnity of the occasion, the hour of the night, the glittering of the moonbeams. He added another element, the thought of the savages in the forest not far away. The danger from Native Americans, though receding, was still there. Noah T. Byers, former business partner, was to be scalped by them 3 years later. The awareness of this apparently sinister presence lurking among the dark trees strengthens the sense of contrast between the light and the darkness, good and evil. There is something here of the sensibility of Fenimore Cooper's Last of the Mohicans, published a few years earlier, about these descriptions of the scene. Here, in reality, not fiction, people were enacting great deeds in an evocative landscape. They were creating something serene and noble in a wild country. They were moulding a new Texas. What then were the rival elements competing with the Baptist revivalists to shape the young republic? There is a great deal of evidence in and around the revival of hostile forces in the field. First, there was the rough culture that flourished on the frontier. Washington contained a large transient population, birds of passage. Although generally respectful to the more permanent residents, they loved to prey on greenhorns newly arrived from the States. Tricking the greenies, as they called them, into handing over their savings was a favourite pastime. Many of these ne'er-do-wells were attracted by the horse racing that was regularly organised just south of the town. Their gambling, though technically illegal in the Republic, flourished openly. This section of the community loved whiskey and cards, spending much of their time in the two main bars, especially the one run by John Rumsey, who, unlike the other, gave credit. Drink sometimes spawned violence, and it's noteworthy that the Methodist preacher who sometimes visited a Washington bar to hold meetings wore pistols while he preached. The streets of the town looked no different on Sunday from any other day. The rough element loved to ridicule the pious. Knowing of the Methodist preacher's favourite hymn, that it was "Blow Ye the Trumpet," one of the ne'er-do-wells disturbed the service by blowing a steer horn outside the window. Pseudo-prayer meetings were held in a bar. They would sing imitation hymns, pass round bread and wine, and even copy the inflections of the Lord's Prayer on a violin. Z.N. Morrell claimed that this type of mockery ended in the 1830s, but memories of it were fresh when Tryon arrived in the town. It was a type of satirical counter-theatre that sought to undermine religion by exposing it to ridicule. This was tacit recognition by the rough culture of the threat to its very existence posed by evangelicals, such as Methodists and Baptists. One of those who wrote accounts of the revival at the time gave particular prominence to this form of popular irreligion at Washington. Joseph Huckins was the senior American Baptist Home Missionary Society agent in Texas, reporting regularly on progress to his employers. He was to become one of the founders of Baylor, now commemorated on a monument on Spate Avenue, just up that way, I think, alongside Judge Baylor. Huckins was a New Englander, born in New Hampshire in 1807, who was trying to create a fresh New England community on the shores of the Gulf of Mexico at Galveston. He was well educated, having trained at Brown University under Francis Wayland and attended courses at Andover, the leading congregational theological seminary, while minister in that town. He'd served 3 New England churches altogether before enrolling in the American Baptist Home Missionary Society and being dispatched to explore the possibilities of a mission to Texas in 1839. After 20 years in Galveston, Huckins was to move to the prestigious pulpit of Wentworth Street Baptist Church in Charleston, South Carolina. To Texas observers, Huckins seemed too much the intellectual, always reading his sermons, engaging in argument in the pulpit, and weak in his gestures. It was his mission, this fastidious man supposed, to bring greater refinement to the unpolished republic. On meeting Judge Baylor for the first time, for example, the judge looked him over and immediately ordered a new suit of clothes for him from a Houston merchant. He wasn't well enough dressed. From the flourishing port of Galveston, Huckins wrote disdainfully of the area around Washington as the interior. His aim, as he put it, was to give system and order to the excitable and impulsive material which preponderates in this country. Huckins did not disapprove of revival as too expressive a form of religion, though. On the contrary, he warmly approved it. But he saw it as having a particular role. It was to civilize the natives. Hence, Huckins' accounts of the events at Washington place great emphasis on the moral transformation of the town. He depicted the place before the revival in the darkest hues. This town, I suppose, he wrote to a minister in New York, has exceeded any town in the Republic for its wickedness. Gambling, drunkenness, murder, and every species of vice reigned. But the revival, he went on to insist, had effected great change. Some of the most desperate men in the country, he wrote, were there prostrate before God, pleading for pardon. Where mock prayer meetings used to be held, real prayer meetings now took place. There had been, as he put it, an entire moral revolution. Now, his motive in this type of description is transparent. He's trying to show the supporters of the Texas mission in New York and New England that their efforts are worthwhile. Thus, he wrote to the ABHM secretary about what he calls your missionary labours in Washington. The money contributed back east, where Huckins had toured on behalf of Texas, was bearing fruit. Revival, he was saying, was vanquishing roughness. To a remarkable degree, reality comes close to the image presented by Huckins. Converts entered a Christian world with higher standards of behaviour. The Union Baptist Association, to which Washington affiliated that same year, had rules of decorum for its meetings, under which mutual respect was ensured. The appellation of brother, ran Article 12, shall be used in association by members in all cases. Liquor, if at all, was to be used abstemiously. The association had already endorsed the formation of a temperance society, so that the stream of liquid fire which has desolated other countries may not blast and wither the rising prospects of this young and interesting republic. Tryon, 3 years later, was to urge the churches of the association, in similar words, to discountenance those broils and feuds which set the law and government at defiance and are the blast and mildew of our country. Instead, church members were to disseminate the examples of forbearance. His own church at Washington led the way. It is true that not all converts remained faithful. 5 years after the revival, the church membership was down from 50 to 36. Yet it was remembered that after the revival, Washington was never as wild as it has been before. The revival of 1841 marked an epoch in the life of the town. The rough culture was disciplined. A second hostile force threatening the new Texas, alongside the rough culture, however, was not a symptom of social laxity, but a feature of intellectual life. What was called infidelity, or often by its advocates, free thought, was widespread at the time. That did not usually mean outright atheism. More commonly, it meant deism, the acknowledgement that there was a God who had created the world, but allied to the supposition that he took no further interest in it. Deists denied the doctrines of providence, the conviction that the Almighty cares for the world, and of revelation, the belief that God makes known his will and purposes supremely through the Bible. Deism was a typical belief of the secular Enlightenment of the 18th century, professed, for example, by Voltaire, and it had been embraced in some form by many of the founding fathers of the United States, including Thomas Jefferson. Usually containing a strain of anti-clericalism, deism seemed to many a natural accompaniment of republicanism, a repudiation of autocratic rule in the universe, as in the state. several deists lived in Washington-on-the-Brazos. And it was one of the achievements of the Washington revival to bring some of them to full-blooded Christian allegiance. Among the converts, it was said, were several leaders in infidelity. 3 of them spoke during the revival. They publicly warned sinners of the great danger of their fighting against the King of Kings. Unbelievers, the converts urged, should cease their rebellion and accept the King's terms of mercy. Free thought was a live intellectual alternative to Christian faith in early Texas. The most striking instance of a freethinker converted at Washington in 1841 was William H. Ewing. Possessing an extensive acreage as a reward for military service in the Texas Revolution, Ewing was living at Washington by 1837 and acted as a local judge. Deafness, however, forced him to give up the practice of the law, and instead he turned to teaching in the town, which for some reason was thought appropriate for somebody suffering from deafness. Like many small-town teachers, Ewing was something of an autodidact intellectual. He read widely and took a special interest in deism, devouring every book he could find on the subject for 20 years and accepting its leading principles. Hearing of the plan of the Baptists to hold a public immersion on the Brazos on the first Sunday of the revival, he attended in pugnacious mood. He seems to have been specially incensed that the baptismal candidate was a black slave. Perhaps Ewing thought her insufficiently educated to make any commitment to Christian belief. Standing on the banks of the Brazos, Ewing denounced the whole event. Immediately afterwards, however, he seems to have had a sense of remorse for what he'd done. He started to consider whether perhaps those involved in the baptism were in the right after all. He no doubt attended the second baptismal ceremony on the Monday evening because, as he put it, the baptizing at night was a sight which called forth holier and more sublime feelings than I ever expect to experience again. By Tuesday, he joined in the revival service as a seeker of mercy himself and embraced a personal faith in Christ. Ewing described the awakening for the press in rapt terms. He'd heard of no greater revival, he confessed, save the days of Pentecost. There was still a trace of deistic language in his account of what happened. He wrote of happy beings offering praise to him who is worthy of all adoration. But there was no doubt of his sincerity. At the meeting of the Baptist Association in October, he several times testified to what God had done for him. In the following February, he was licensed as an exhorter and preached at Washington. He even contemplated becoming a full-time preacher, though that did not happen, and by 1846, he was once more acting as a local judge. But he had quickly gained the confidence of his brethren. He was appointed to the Association Executive Committee in October 1841 and was its clerk the following year. Ewing was the prize convert of the Washington revival. Both before and after his conversion, Ewing was eager for the advance of civilization. In the years before 1841, he'd conceived it as the spread of rational knowledge, free from all taint of superstition. That was no doubt the ideal he set before him when in 1838 he was preparing a printing press in Washington with all its appurtenances. He planned to print a regular newspaper, but the plan failed to come to fruition, probably because of the dispersal of the town's population that soon followed. This scheme for promoting the values of the secular Enlightenment came to nothing. The most enterprising Baptist in the town, however, Anderson Buffington, acquired the press from Ewing and in partnership with a friend, Foster Briggance, started a newspaper called after the local wildlife, the tarantula. Published weekly on a Saturday, the newspaper was launched in March 1841, the same month as the Baptist church in the town. The initial issue transcribed the minutes of the first meeting of the Baptist Association in order to excite its readers, and in an editorial appealed to Robert Howell, minister of First Baptist Church, Nashville, to send books and hymn books. A Baptist library, it remarked, is much needed in this country. The newspaper's devotion to Baptist affairs during the spring of 1841 must have been one of the causes preparing the mind of the public for the revival that followed. But the tarantula operated in very difficult conditions. So scarce was paper for printing in the Republic that Buffington had to go round the town collecting blank leaves from children's spelling books. The newspaper was also short of subscribers. Buffington dropped out of its management in October 1841, and the newspaper came to an early end in the following year. But for a while, the newspaper tried to promote a very different formula from that which Ewing had projected. Whereas Ewing in his unregenerate days had envisaged the press as an organ of secular progress, Buffington saw its enlightening role as bound up with the cause of religion. For Buffington, Christian faith and book learning belonged together. After his conversion, Ewing came to look at things in a similar light. By 1845, he too was publishing a newspaper called The Lone Star and Southern Watchman. He'd already stated his own new ideal in 1841. In the revival, civilization, as he put it, had taken religion as an helpmate. The cause of civilizing Texas would be helped rather than hindered by true religion. Faith would not subvert reason, but reinforce it. Free thought was vanquished by the revival. The third force competing for the soul of Texas was admittedly a weaker one. It was, however, potentially serious for the energetic Baptists such as Huckins and Tryon, for it was an internal grouping in the denomination that threatened to divide and neutralize its efforts. It consisted of the so-called anti-missionary Baptists, often later called primitive Baptists. The anti-missionaries were high Calvinists who emphasized divine sovereignty. They did not object to the standard preaching of the gospel because that was a God-ordained instrument of his purposes. But they did object to newfangled agencies such as the American Baptist Home Mission. The anti-missionaries were concerned for their pockets too. It was serious that such bodies were constantly demanding money from church members for new missionary enterprises. But the fundamental anti-missionary case was not economic. It was that there was no scripture warrant for such organisations. The societies purported to do what the Almighty would achieve by his own agency, the gathering of the elect. The anti-missionaries therefore resisted any support for societies, whether for mission or for education. There was more than a hint of anti-intellectualism about their objections. Modern learning, they held, was a snare that could divert the believer from the simple message of the Bible. In the vicinity of Washington, there were several anti-missionary preachers. One was Abner Smith, founder of Providence Church in 1834. In 1840, Abner Smith refused to join the newly founded Union Baptist Association. He assigned the ground for not joining is that he is not a United Baptist, but claims to be a regular disunited Baptist. Such men believed, with some reason, that they represented the traditional Baptist convictions of their forefathers. The anti-missionary Baptists were uncompromising defenders of the ancient ways. Baptists such as Huckins and Tryon, the so-called missionary Baptists, by contrast, welcomed modern thought. They broadly upheld the principles of the New England theology that emerged among the successors of Jonathan Edwards in Congregationalism, softening the sharp edges of traditional Calvinism. The Baptist who best represented their point of view was Andrew Fuller, the English minister who was the first secretary of the Baptist Missionary Society. To Judge Baylor, for example, Fuller was good and great. Fullerism was still Calvinistic in upholding the sovereignty of God in electing to salvation, but it held that if sinners ultimately perished, it was their own fault. Fullerites rejected the doctrine of double predestination, the belief that God was himself responsible for consigning the unsaved to perdition. Therefore, they're usually called moderate Calvinists. They were equally moderate in accepting the pragmatic temper of the times. Techniques not set out in the Bible could be employed in achieving the great aim of spreading the gospel. Thus, there could be societies for missions and for education. These were the means that the Almighty used to exercise his sovereignty. The moderate spirit, the pragmatic temper were alike signs that these Baptists had come to terms with the Enlightenment. They were prepared to modify their principles in the light of contemporary knowledge. Unlike the advocates of the secular Enlightenment, they were not abandoning the Bible, but they were presenting the teachings of Scripture in a form more palatable to an enlightened age. From the start, the Union Baptist Association adopted Fullerite principles. Article 6 contended that when sinners were not saved, it was because of their voluntary rejection of the gospel. 4 years later, the association adopted the New Hampshire Confession of Faith of 1833, a widely used statement of the same moderate Calvinistic standpoint. So Washington and the churches with which it identified was of the more modern persuasion. They were missionary Baptists identified with the moderate Enlightenment. One advocate of their views was James L. Farquhar, a man concerned to ensure that the missionary Baptists triumphed over their anti-missionary contemporaries. Farquhar was the sole deacon of the Washington Church at the time of the revival. He was 34 years old, originally from North Carolina and then of Mississippi. In 1840, he decided to seek his fortunes in Texas, settling 4 miles from Washington on the road to independence. He owned 320 acres, and his wife, Huldah, was owner in her own right of 15 slaves brought with her from Mississippi. In the first year, Farquhar planted about 20 acres of cotton, which turned out to be of a high quality. A visitor reported that he considers the cotton land superior to any in Mississippi or Florida, and equal probably to any in the world. Farquhar was, in fact, an enthusiastic patriot for his adopted land. He wrote with pride of our country and the infant republic by contrast with the United States. He claimed to know nowhere where as good attention was paid to sermons as in Texas. So Farquhar was eager that the new nation should adopt the right outlook. That outlook was of the Fullerite paradigm. Accordingly, in his report of the revival, Farquhar stresses some of the themes of missionary Baptist thinking. Centrally, he contended that the Almighty was a God of means. The Lord certainly possessed all power in heaven and earth, as the anti-missionaries insisted, but that did not mean that believers were to leave the spread of the gospel to divine providence. On the contrary, unless means were used, very little good would be done. One means was able preachers. Farquhar wrote of Tryon as someone sent by the Lord, an instrument in his own hands. Another means was prayer. Farquhar wrote of Tryon as someone sent by the Lord. Another means was prayer. Farquhar drew attention to the prayer meetings, seeking an outpouring of the Holy Spirit that preceded the revival. Through prayer, Farquhar believed the gospel would spread throughout the globe. Like Jonathan Edwards, he looked for the salvation of all the earth. He was a post-millennial optimist, expecting the universal triumph of the Redeemer. The revival at Washington was evidence that God was fulfilling his promises and blessing the use of means. Farquhar was recognized by his contemporaries as being well-versed in theology. The association put him on its committee over the Articles of Faith in 1842, so that he was one of those responsible for the formal adoption of the New Hampshire Confession. These principles, he believed, would confute the anti-missionaries. May the Lord convince them, he wrote in his report of the revival, of their error in opposing the spread of the gospel. He was deploying the awakening as a vindication of missionary Baptist convictions. Those convictions had to be articulated by a well-educated ministry. It was the missionary Baptists, therefore, who were responsible for the institution that became Baylor. Farquhar had been dismissed at the time of the foundation of the Washington Church. Been dismayed at the time of the foundation of the Washington Church. So dismayed that Tryon, the popular qualified minister, could preach there only on one Sunday a month. These he regarded as unfavourable circumstances, which made the revival that ensued the more remarkable. So Farquhar was one of those who saw the supply of trained ministers as an urgent requirement. He fully backed the creation of a Texas Home Missionary Society at the association meeting following the revival, becoming its vice president. It was to support preaching in the destitute parts of this republic. The society immediately appointed Anderson Buffington, its paid missionary, ordaining him and dispatching him into the adjacent county. But Buffington had received no formal theological training, and both Farquhar and Tryon saw that as essential. Tryon believed that the first attempt at a Washington church in the 1830s had failed, partly because Z.N. Morrell, its pastor, was an unpolished frontiersman. The church lacked, as he put it, the right kind of ministry. It was Tryon who first suggested the idea of a Baptist literary institution in Texas. Tryon, therefore, is deservedly commemorated as another of the founders of Baylor in a monument on Spate Avenue. At the association meeting in October 1841, encouraged by news of the revival, that meeting set up a Texas Baptist Education Society with the aim of creating an academical and theological institution. The result, after a stage of money-raising and petitioning Congress, was the establishment in 1845 of Baylor University, named after the judge who conducted the revival. His first instructor, Henry Flavel Gillette, was an Episcopalian whom Farquhar had induced to come to Washington to open a school, Union Academy, in the summer of 1841, immediately after the revival. Farquhar remained a devoted backer of Baylor until his death in 1873. The institution was an embodiment of the victory of the missionary Baptists over the anti-missionaries in Texas. On the one hand, it provided the education that the anti-missionaries thought superfluous or dangerous. On the other, it was sponsored by a society, a non-ecclesiastical agency that the anti-missionaries considered unbiblical and subversive. It represented the acceptance of the modern use of means in the way acceptable to the Enlightenment. The fourth element, and the final one in the competition for cultural hegemony in Texas, was Campbellism. Alexander Campbell, after whom the movement was named, was an Ulsterman who'd come to America associated with Baptists, but who had gradually adopted distinctive principles. Campbell believed that the task of the age was the restoration of the pattern of the earliest church. The New Testament was a sort of law book. If its principles of church order were followed, Christians need not be divided by any theology derived from other books. The Campbellites habitually appealed to reason, holding debates with freethinkers. They deplored any requirements for religious experience that might cloud the intellect. They denounced Methodists, for example, with their insistence on assurance of salvation, for introducing a false mysticism into religion. The Campbellites can rightly be seen as taking the acceptance of the Enlightenment much further than Fullerites amongst the Baptists. Campbellites held that true religion consisted solely in mental assent, not in personal faith. Thus, they would baptize anyone willing to profess that Christ is the Son of God without any exploration of whether or not the person had passed through a conversion experience. Theirs was a religion of the head, not of the heart. This radical Enlightenment perspective on Christianity was propagated by Campbell through his magazine, The Millennial Harbinger. It circulated widely among Baptists, from whom Campbellites were not yet wholly distinct. Only gradually did they emerge as a separate denomination, turning eventually into the Disciples or Churches of Christ. Meanwhile, Campbellite views posed a challenge to many Baptist churches. This outlook was making inroads into the Washington region in around 1840, the year before the revival. Near LaGrange in Fayette County, about 60 miles south, a Campbellite church was set up on his plantation by Colonel John H. Moore. At LaGrange also, there was a Baptist church, and its minister, Thomas W. Cox, was soon influenced by Campbellite views. Another of the three churches Cox served was Independence in Washington County. There, a deacon, Dr. John Clow, also embraced Campbell's principles, and early in 1841 immersed Lindsay P. Rucker, a Washington schoolmaster. This was a double affront to Baptist practice. The baptism should have been performed by an ordained minister and was not, and the candidate was not required to relate his experience of coming to salvation before baptism. William Tryon, who became pastor in Washington in March 1841, had also been appointed co-pastor at Independence. In the same month, he preached against Clow's Act, and the church resolved that Rucker's baptism was invalid. Tryon was setting his face against Campbellite teaching and practice. He must have feared the same views would soon outcrop at Washington itself. Tryon was well fitted to resist a theological and pastoral challenge. Born in 1809, he'd been a protege of Charles D. Mallory, minister of First Baptist Church, Atlanta, Georgia. Mallory had encouraged Tryon to become one of the first students to pass through Mercer Institute, now university, to gain academic credentials in theology. Subsequently, Tryon had served the Georgia Baptist Convention, raising funds for mission and education in the manner of the missionary Baptists. He was then minister of 3 Alabama churches, in 2 of which there were revivals in 1838. Having met James Huckins, he volunteered for pioneer service in Texas with the American Baptist Home Mission. So Tryon was a man of experience when he came to live halfway between Washington and Independence. His style also fitted him for an encounter with the Campbellites. Although his Bible knowledge was not thought to be equal to that of the other preachers, he had a gift of presenting old truths in a fresh light. He was capable of reasoning in the pulpit, habitually putting the middle finger and thumb of his right hand together to make a cogent point. But he also probed the conscience in his sermons, exhorting his congregations powerfully. Judge Baylor remembered that he made solemn appeals to the sinner and caused him to feel as if the doom of eternity hung upon the choice he was then about to make. He could deploy pathos and sometimes wept in the pulpit. So Tryon combined reason with emotion. He could meet the Campbellites on the field of reason, but unlike them, he believed that religious experience was the kernel of religion. Tryon's perspective is evident in his conduct of the revival. He wanted to generate not just intellectual conviction, but personal commitment. After his preaching had affected the congregation, an invitation, as he put it, was given to those who desired the prayers of God's people. Members of the congregation who were anxious to seek salvation had to indicate their condition by raising a hand so that believers could offer intercessions on their behalf. There was also a mourner's seat at the front, where those wanting prayer to be focused on them for salvation could go. This element was very much in the style of Charles Finney, whose lectures on revival of religion of 1835 had recommended these special measures. Tryon emphasised in his account of the awakening the deep feeling, the streaming eyes, the hearts affected, all his words. He particularly reports a very respectable citizen speaking to him afterwards, saying, "This is the first religious meeting at which I have ever wept." In a similar way, Baylor, who carried on the revival after Tryon, was known for his willingness to shed tears in the pulpit. His favourite sermon, in fact, was on the text, "Jesus wept." Those responsible for the Washington revival, therefore, were not afraid of emotion. Their conception of religion was that it was a matter of the heart as well as the head. The struggle with the Campbellites in the locality came to a climax in the immediate aftermath of the revival. The association meeting in October 1841 was held under the auspices of the LaGrange Church. Its minister, Thomas W. Cox, now a Campbellite, used the opportunity to invite people to become candidates for baptism. They were merely asked 3 questions about their intellectual opinions and nothing about their religious experience. Huckins protested, but Cox responded that this was an affair of the church alone. The church was about to go Campbellite. But as it happens, at the crucial moment, news arrived that Cox, this Campbellite trying to lead his church in this direction, had been involved in shady business dealings back in Alabama. The church promptly excluded him, and it was saved for the missionary Baptists. Washington had no similar experience of actual conflict, partly because 2 leaders, Buffington and Henry R. Cartmel, had been at Nashville, Tennessee, when a battle was fought in the First Baptist Church there against similar Campbellite entryism. They knew what to resist. But it was also partly because of the revival that Campbellism did not penetrate Washington. When religious emotion was so obviously manifest, it was hard not to see personal experience as a necessary qualification for baptism. The revival therefore played its part in resisting the challenge of the Campbellites. And after the revival, future generations of preachers had to be trained in correct views, to recognise that true religion was heart religion. And that too was part of why Tryon proposed the creation of a college just like Mercer, where he'd been given his academic preparation for ministry. And that new institution, which became Baylor, was designed in part to combat Campbellite views. Like the revival, Baylor was to resist the radical Enlightenment in its religious guise. And so, the awakening at Washington-on-the-Brazos in 1841 was no marginal episode. Rather, it was near the heart of the cultural strife over the future destiny of Texas. Because the Republic was marked by frontier conditions, the rough culture loomed large. Most weighty citizens, however, believed that the young country must be civilized. The central question was how far there should be an influx of Enlightenment influences pervading the English-speaking world at the time. According to the freethinkers, the solution was the secular Enlightenment, with its exclusion of revealed religion. But Christian people were not content with that solution. They differed among themselves, however, about how far to allow religion to be affected by the rational currents associated with the Enlightenment. The anti-missionary Baptists were stalwart in their views. There must be no watering down of high Calvinism and no compromise with newfangled societies. There must be resistance to the Enlightenment. The Campbellites, on the other hand, wanted to apply rationality more deeply to religion, and so to adopt a radical Enlightenment form of Christianity. Each of these forces, however, went down before the missionary Baptists. They claimed Washington-on-the-Brazos for a blending of Christianity with Enlightenment influences, but only in a moderate form. The missionary Baptists won the battle against roughness, the secular Enlightenment, resistance to the Enlightenment, and the radical Enlightenment. They then proceeded to found Baylor to perpetuate their victory. The college was designed to institutionalize the evangelical views of missionary Baptists. In the year before the revival, Judge Baylor wrote of the potential of the young and beautiful republic. If we, he went on, as instruments in the hands of Providence, shall be enabled to give the moral and intellectual elements of society here a happy direction, whilst this country is still in its infancy, unborn millions will rise up and call us blessed. The awakening gave Judge Baylor, Tryon, Huckins and their colleagues the opportunity to do exactly that. The Washington Revival of 1841 was a pivotal missionary Baptist victory in the struggle for the soul of Texas. Baylor University was founded to help make their triumph permanent. Thank you very much. Thank you.
I noted that the only woman who appeared in this narrative was the slave hunter.
Yep.
I'm just wondering, and I'm assuming that your sources are just not allowing you to have very much insight into the women who are involved in this congregation and in the revival, but I wonder if perhaps you have a sense of how important women were in this revival or in other aspects of Baptist, early Baptist life in Texas.
Thank you. It is a serious omission, and in large measure it does reflect the sources. However, some of the sources provide hints which in the longer version of this paper, which will eventually be published, are expanded. In the first place, the slave girl. She really was obviously very important, and there were other female slaves who actually joined the church in the course of the revival. The female slave who actually precipitated the revival, and essentially is the most important person in the whole story, does seem to have been a rather bold person in that she was actually taking the lead in being baptised first. She must have been a person of very great conviction. She's always called a girl, not a woman, in the different sources, so I suspect she was a teenager. A very remarkable phenomenon, therefore. There are one or two other women, and I'll pin on one, if I may, that we know played a significant part in the revival. And one of them was Mrs. Annabel Bledsoe. She was the wife of one of the leading planters in the area, who was a regular member of the church. He wasn't a very popular man in the town, but she was a very winsome woman. Her sister was the second wife of Sam Houston, the creator of Texas by victory over the Mexicans, and then one of the presidents of the Republic near its start, and then again president in subsequent years. He was out of office at the time of the revival, but he was shortly to become president again. And we do know that his sister-in-law, who was involved in the revival, had a very significant role because she reported on the revival through her sister to Sam Houston, who, when he became president the following year, said, aha, we need somewhere to transfer the capital away from that disturbed place, Austin. We need a nice, safe place. Let's transfer the capital to Washington. And he did. Nobody wanted him to. The citizens of Austin refused to let the state archives go and kept them by force in Austin, training a cannon on people who tried to take them away. So the government operated between 1842 and 45 with no state archives. But nevertheless, the seat of government was in Washington because it was cleaned up, and it was Mrs. Bledsoe who did the reporting on that. Now, that's a very, very important role. So, yes, the woman in that case was crucial. Let me take just as the third example of a woman, Sam Houston's wife, her sister. During the time of the revival, we actually have the correspondence of Sam Houston with his wife. It's been published. And I think that is very revealing of one of the most characteristic roles of women amongst early Texas Baptists. She pleads with him delicately to become a Christian. He was still not a free thinker. He believed in providence, but he said in one of his letters to her in 1841, the very year of the revival, something like, I know that I am not yet an object of grace, but I'm seeking to become one, and I've stopped cussing. So he was on the way, as it were. But she then very delicately pointed out to him the central evangelical message about sin and salvation. And we have the actual words, and they're very, very skillfully deployed. She was a very capable woman, as were the other members of her family. And eventually, Sam Houston was to be baptised as a believer at Independence in 1856, so it worked. So we know that that's what was going on, and I suspect that many other women had that sort of quiet, persistent influence for the spread of the same principles that the people I've been talking about were promoting. Thank you.
Did anti-mission forces have more luck in other areas of Texas? Obviously, they couldn't film their own school, so.
Yeah. Yes, indeed they did. Perhaps the most celebrated instance, which I'm sure will be known to you, is that of Daniel Parker, who was far away on the northern fringe of Texas. But he had his own separate brand of Baptist faith. Two Seed in the Spirit Baptists were led by Daniel Parker. They believed that there was a spirit of good and a seed of good and a seed of evil, and these seeds made certain people permanently either children of light or children of darkness. So they were very, very rigid Calvinists. Now, he did indeed have anti-missionary views of a very, very deep-seated kind. He eventually went away to Illinois, but for a while he propagated those. A lot of these characters were pretty angular and idiosyncratic. He certainly was. Another one was actually notorious as one of the most libertine characters in one of the towns further west from Washington. And it was thought that he was actually an antinomian, that is to say, he believed that the law no longer applied to Christians, and so he was regularly seen drunk on a Saturday evening and in the pulpit on a Sunday morning. Now, this was not regarded as a good thing, but he again is an anti-missionary Baptist. So they come in many sizes and many types. They didn't actually become dominant in any sector of Texas, so far as I'm aware. There are still plenty of them, not least round to the west of Fort Worth, I believe. But there are quite a few in East Texas too. But they don't become dominant as they did, for example, in southwestern Georgia or other parts of the Carolinas, about which you are a specialist. It's very much a regional thing. It'll be fascinating to try and draw a precise map of the distribution of missionary and anti-missionary churches, say, in 1830, 1840, 1850, and at decadal intervals thereafter, and see how the shift changed over time and relate it to the social, economic and cultural factors at work. That perhaps would make a very good PhD for anybody sitting on the third row. Thank you.
Were leaders of the Church of Washington aware of other revivals that were taking place throughout the country?
Absolutely. They subscribed to newspapers from Georgia and Alabama, which reported regularly on what was going on elsewhere, and the aspect of religious life that these newspapers most liked reporting on was revivals. People were encouraged to give descriptions of revivals, and they did. They're often pretty generic. They don't go into enormous detail about what actually happened. Everybody knew what happened in revival, so a lot of them are pretty formal, as it were, standard, fitting a template. But nevertheless, they knew that there was a revival here, that lots of people were converted, and that, of course, was one of the strongest inducements to pray for revival, to work for revival, to go in for revival themselves. Buffington, as I mentioned, had previously been in Tennessee, where there had been revivals in which he'd been involved there. So he brought the memory of revivals. It wasn't just that they read them, they'd been involved in them. And Tryon had led revivals only 3 years before, back in Alabama. So these people, yes, were intimately involved in revival culture. This is the tone of the Second Great Awakening, where local community-based revivals are the norm. That is the way in which churches are expected to operate. They go for a few years without one, then they have one. They go for a few years without one, then they have another. They go for a few years, it's almost as though they look at their watch and think it's time for another. There's a revival cycle that commonly operates in the churches. And that was true not just in Texas, not just in the South, but in many parts of the English-speaking world. You find exactly the same phenomenon, for example, in Nova Scotia. And indeed, you find it beyond the English-speaking world, not just amongst the Welsh and the Gaelic-speaking people, but you even find it in Northern Europe, in Norway and Denmark. Very similar phenomena, especially in places where there's a lot of water. Baptist revivals tended to flourish where there was water. By the seaside, fishermen were very susceptible to revival. But it's not just to do with the water, it's to do, I'm sure, with the prevalence of death at sea, which made people very conscious of issues of life and death, ultimate significance. Thank you. Yes, Dr. Rayleigh, thank you.
In light of Sam Houston's desire that Texas be true to the Union,
Yes.
and mentioning that a slave girl or teenager was the first baptismal canon, did you find any abolitionist or slavery sentiment, indigenous or inherent, in these revivals, or is that absent from the record?
It's not so much absent from the record as prominently repudiated by people in the record. Huckins was a slave owner, Tryon was a slave owner, some of the other members of the Washington Church were slave owners. But both Huckins and Tryon were two of the individuals employed by the American Baptist Home Missionary Society who were slaveholders, who were the causes of the split off from the Northern Baptists of the Southern Baptist Convention in 1845. Those two were named as people that the Mission Society would no longer support, and the Southerners thought this was an abomination, that slave owners should not be regarded as instruments of the gospel. Slaveholding, they thought, should be a neutral issue. For the Northern abolitionists, of course, who actually gained dominance in the councils of the American Baptist Home Missionary Society at this stage, it should be a decisive issue, and they were no longer funded. So those two are very much involved. When that's been said, another dimension that I didn't go into, which is a very important aspect of this revival, was the place of the African Americans in it. At this juncture, at the end of the Republic of Texas, there was something like 100,000 white people in Texas. There was something like 37,000 black slaves. And the area around Washington was good plantation country, so there's a fair number of slaves in that vicinity. And I have the impression from the church record that a significant number of these slaves were drawn into the church in subsequent years. We know that the slaves in Huckins' church at Galveston were particularly enthusiastic in their worship. He comments on this and wished they'd tone it down a bit, but tolerated it, he being a New Englander of refined taste. But it's very likely that the same style of worship would have been used by the African American slaves in the Church of Washington, and that perhaps helps explain the emphasis on experience and emotion that they wanted to defend against the Campbellites. But there's no trace of abolitionism in these circles at all. Indeed, there's another little interesting detail. Huckins had originally come from New England, and he'd left New England partly because he objected to the local abolitionist frenzy, as he called it. They actually denounced him when he said preaching the gospel is the most important thing in a New England pulpit. It doesn't matter whether you're a slave owner or not. So subsequently, he moved to Texas because he actually was ideologically aligned with the South in the sectional dispute and couldn't stand abolitionists. So he's a stormy petrel of the whole abolitionist question, interestingly. Thank you.
Do you have any record of how Huckins and Tryon treated their slaves? Like, did it seem any more Christian than others in the South?
I know of no record of how those individuals treated their slaves. Knowing how Huckins normally behaved, I would expect him to require his domestic slaves to bring in the dinner on time. That would have been his great insistence, knowing his character. However, we do have evidence of how other contemporaries treated their slaves, and sometimes it was exceedingly badly, and sometimes they were disciplined by their Baptist churches for treating their slaves badly. That is to say, Baptist churches did actually act as a sort of protective buffer for some of the slave population, not necessarily very effectively, and of course not anybody who wasn't a member, but those who were members were expected to maintain certain standards, and those standards were actually made more precise, they were formulated more definitely during the 40s and 50s, and in the 1850s there was a very strong emphasis amongst Methodists and Presbyterians, even more among the Presbyterians actually than the Baptists, on evangelizing the slave population. If you evangelized them, it usually meant that you treated them rather better than if you didn't. You couldn't expect them to convert to your religion if you didn't treat them reasonably well. That wasn't an absolute rule, but that commonly was a rule. And of course, by the late 1850s, a good deal of Southern propaganda was, look how well we treat our slaves, they're much better treated than the wage slaves up north. Thank you.
This is something of a digression from your main topic.
Good.
I wonder if you could speak to the Stone Campbell movement. So I associate that with the Cane Ridge Revival, which I know was a very experiential feeling moment of people dancing in the aisles and falling down and foaming at the mouth and these types of things that we see in the Awakening. Yet we have this Campbellite tradition of extreme, rigid, formal, intellectual religion. How do those continue?
Okay. The people who were involved in the Cane Ridge Revival of 1801 were the Stone people, not the Campbell people. That is to say, it was the people, well, at the time of the Cane Ridge Revival, which was a very expressive one, when people actually barked like dogs and did all sorts of other very exciting things. It is the most exciting revival on record. Stone at the time was a Presbyterian minister, but as a result of that experience and the succession of revivals that followed, he decided that he wanted to cooperate with the Methodists who joined him for that revival and a few Baptists if they wanted to join in and become Christians only. So he started a new movement, Christians only. And that strand only merged with Campbell's strand in the 1840s. And the Campbellite strand was always much more concerned with rational debate and much more suspicious of experience. Sometimes people involved in revivals, even amongst Campbellites, did get the spirit and started having the jerks and all sorts of other exciting things. It wasn't excluded, but it wasn't encouraged. It certainly wasn't encouraged by the ethos or the ideology of the movement. And I sometimes wonder how in a few churches which had a debt to both traditions after their merger in the early 1840s, I sometimes wonder how they coped with having people from those two different backgrounds. They seem to have done so. It's possible that the emphasis on Christian unity in the Stone tradition moved more towards the disciples of Christ dimension of the tradition in subsequent years, and the Campbellite tradition moved more towards the churches of Christ tradition in later years, as the disciples became more ecumenical and the churches of Christ became not ecumenical by and large, with a few exceptions. So the subsequent split in the movement may in part reflect that earlier binary nature of the movement. Thank you. There's somebody. Thank you very much. Thank you. I'll follow the arrows. Thank you very much. Very helpful.
Prayer for revival has always been very important, preceding the direct move of God. It seemed that Baylor and Tryon and Buffington all seemed to understand that. Do you know how they came to have that understanding of the importance of prayer for revival? And do you know anything about the content of those evening prayer meetings they held?
It was universally accepted that prayer for revival was a good thing at this time, and that churches that wanted revival should pray for it. And you're absolutely right, there is an almost constant conjunction between powerful revivals and specific prayer for revival in the place beforehand. It's not absolutely constant, because sometimes prayer for revival is being offered elsewhere, but it's almost in that church. But it's almost impossible to find instances of revival without prayer beforehand. This is not just a theological point, it is a historical point, in that empirically that can be established. Indeed, a historian who has looked at revival in America and in Wales in some detail has shown that there is no single factor of any kind that precedes revivals consistently, like, for example, economic distress or being on the frontier or any of the socio-economic factors that various historians suggested. None of those is a constant precursor of revival. Prayer and expectation of a revival is. They are always there. In terms of the revival that I've spoken of, we don't know anything that was said at the prayer meetings. Alas, very few people record what is said at prayer meetings. I wish they would. It would be a huge boon to historians 200 years later. It would also actually be quite edifying to other people at the time and might actually lead to more revivals. The revival tradition is very intimately associated with prayer right from its start in the 17th century right up to the 21st century. The type of prayer, however, offered for revival has changed enormously, so that revival in the 18th century, for example, was very much prayer for the hastening of the millennium. Now, you wouldn't find much of that prayer in revival in the late 20th century, the millennium being conceived in post-millennial terms. So the way in which prayer has been prayed in relation to revival has changed, but prayer, as you rightly say, has been as constant as anything else. Thank you.
Regarding the 9 baptisms you talked about, do you feel that they are like a pivotal part of the revival because it's like after the workday more people can participate?
In revivals, people commonly stopped work, where they decided that there were some things more important than work. And in a place where there are only 100 people, that was very practical. So I suspect that they not only could, well, I know that they did stop work in some afternoons, because there were afternoon meetings as well as the baptisms in the evening. However, you're absolutely right that they're pivotal. Those baptisms at night actually were thrilling. They were very, very exciting. It's what people in their memoirs 60 years later remembered as having been crucial in their childhood. More than one, 2 people I know of whom that's true. And they look back on it as a spectacle that actually made vivid and visible something about the value of Christian commitment. I think in a culture which is overwhelmed by Baptist principles, in a state where there are supposed to be, 8 million Baptists at the moment, something like that, one tends to forget that baptism was once non-existent as believers' baptism. Oh yes, children were christened, but that's not like getting wet in public, totally. The rite of baptism of somebody of mature years by immersion was novel, very striking and very powerful because it was visual. And that visual power is evidenced again and again in many parts of the English-speaking world as having made a huge impact in church growth. So I'm sure you're right to use the word pivotal. It helped, of course, there were all those beautiful features of the white to contrast with the dark. And in a sense, those are the incidentals. But that's part of the benefit of living on the banks of the Brazos, in which we share.
One more question? Could you just list quickly the other revivals in your book, kind of whet our appetite for the appearance of the book?
That's very kind of you to allow me to do an advert. Revival number 1, you'll be pleased to know, is Baptist Revival at Washington-on-the-Brazos. That's the star, that's the opener. After that, we move to a revival amongst the Wesleyan Methodists in Cornwall, in the southwest of England, in 1849. Then one amongst the primitive Methodists, who were very primitive, in County Durham, in the north of England, in 1851. Then back to North America for a Presbyterian revival in 1857 in North Carolina. Then on to a revival in somewhere else. Which is next? Oh yes, the Scottish one, of course, the one nearest home. In Ferryden, in a fishing village amongst Presbyterians, but where some sinister people turn up and disrupt it, who are early Plymouth Brethren, very dangerous people. That is a fascinating conflict. Then that was 1859. Then on after that to 1875, when there was a revival in South Australia amongst Methodists, which there is probably more evidence for than any other. And then the final one was amongst Baptists in Nova Scotia in 2 fishing townships, the bottom left-hand corner of Nova Scotia in 1880. All of them are community revivals. They are based on what happened in a particular township at a particular time, in a particular place. And the attempt in this book is to find out everything I can
about everybody who was involved, whether it's a promoter or convert, and try and put it together into a coherent picture. This book is concerned with the particularity of revival, not just generalisations about them. There are only 7, I'm sorry, but if you want to try to be particular like that, you can't really afford more than 7. But it should be out in spring, and I hope that we'll get at least 100 more sales as a result of the advert. Thank you very much.
Let's thank Dr. Bebbington.